Hi everyone, welcome back from break. I hope you've all had lots of coffee and you're not feeling too relaxed. You've had a little stretch. Welcome to our afternoon session of Beyond. My name is Katie Popperwell, and as Nihal said, I am chair of Manchester City of Literature. Manchester City of Literature is part of the UNESCO Creative Cities Network. Some of you may know about that, some of you may not. It's a network of cities all around the world who have identified culture as a factor, a strategic factor in sustainable development. And each one of those cities can apply to get a designation in a particular art form. And in Manchester, we are a city of literature and very proud to be so. One of the first questions that people often ask me when I tell them about the UNESCO Creative Cities Network is they say, and is there any money? And I say, no, there isn't any money. And then sometimes I lose them, but then sometimes we end up having a really interesting conversation, which is, all right, well, if it's not about money, then what is it about? And that's segueing me into what we're going to be talking about today, because as creative practitioners, researchers, policymakers, all the incredible people that do all the incredible things that you all do in this room, we have to be very, very good at talking about the value of creativity and culture in terms of economic indicators, right? We have to be able to tell the story about the metrics, the hard metrics. But in telling that story, there's so much that we miss out. So if we take the example of job creation as an economic indicator, that would give us the impression in a reductive way that all jobs are created equal, which everyone in this room knows is not the case, and we've heard so much about today. So, with that in mind, we are going to, for the next half an hour, we're going to put those hard economic indicators to one side. And with these three incredible global creative leaders, we're going to offer an alternative to those traditional metrics of growth and think about how creativity is meaningful in our cities beyond economic measures, and how investment in creativity can get us closer to the cities that we actually want to live in, and making them people-centred rather than economy-centred. So I'm going to allow my panellists to invite my panellists even to introduce themselves to you, and with a specific focus on how their work relates to the theme of this panel. So Hector, we'll start with you.
Cool. Hi everybody. My name is Hector. I'm a culture curator, and I co-CEO an organization called Xquizified Partnership, where we support and enable social and creative entrepreneurs and exploring inclusive approach to community building, or imagining what the community or the city of Johannesburg could look like when we all put together our creativity forward to come up with ideas. So some of the stuff that we do is we have a space called the Makers Valley Studio, where we have free access to studio space, free internet and resources such as camera work. We have different programs throughout the whole year to support people to access information and spaces. And we do work outside of the community on the street, such as edible gardens, cleaning up or a dump site area, creating edible gardens, placemaking, art murals, and activations in the community. And I'm really pleased to be here and share more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hector. Natalia?
Hi everybody, my name is Natalia. I'm excuse me, director and a curator based in Glasgow, Scotland. So not from particularly far, but a little journey. I have a sort of organisational practice and a curatorial programming practice, and they really overlap, or at least I can really see that now. So over the last sort of 15 years, I've been developing creative organisations, thinking about sustainability, so how they can exist for a long period of time so that we can do really embedded community-focused work within those organisations. And as a curator, I'm particularly interested in socially engaged art practice. So that's essentially working with artists to make work together with people and to really think about how that work can exist within a social context. And that is particularly about impact. So it's about making sure that we're working where there's a real opportunity for social change and impact. And I've worked in a sort of rural and in a city context. So we're here today talking about cities and how to reimagine cities. And I think for me, it's really important to take in that rural perspective. For me, working rurally has really informed, in terms of innovation, it's really informed how I can then work in a city context for lots of reasons. And I'm sure we'll go into that a little bit.
We will, and we'll come back to that social impact question a lot later as well. And finally, we're going to go to Moky, and we've got a little video, which is just going to illustrate, which will come up any minute.
So I'll talk
now.
Oh. So I was wondering when they're going to turn it down. So my name is Moky, and I always start off with imagine a world, imagine Africa where we were defined by our music, our food, our fashion, our film, our arts. And that's the Africa that I know. But the reality is that in a lot of ways, Africa is defined by poverty, by corruption, poor leadership, conflict. And that's exactly what Africa No Filter was set up to combat. Those stereotypical narratives about Africa that still persist about the continent. And if anybody's been listening to the news and listened to Bob Geldof, Live Aid at 40, it's all coming back again. So we were set up to fight that, Africa No Filter. And essentially, in order to change a narrative, this narrative of a broken continent, we have to work with storytellers. We need to change the stories that feed that narrative. So we essentially work with storytellers, we work with creatives, and we basically do two things. We're building a community, and in that community we fund creatives. So we are one of the very few African-based arts funders. And what brings me to this conversation is the fact that we funded a study looking at 12 African cities and the creative infrastructure that supports artists and creatives, because we fund artists to go off and tell stories. We want those stories to be seen. But then I thought, well, are there cinemas? Are there theatres? Are there museums where the art is hung? And that's where we came to this work. And it's called the Creative Vibrancy Index. You must check it out online. It's very interactive, and I'm going to talk more about it. Yeah.
We are going to talk more about it. Each of these incredible speakers that we've got with us today, as Nihal mentioned, we have co-produced this panel in collaboration with the British Council, particularly the British Council's Creative Economy team. And the British Council's Creative Economy team have a new strategy, which I think is really extraordinary when you pay attention to it. It's about putting people and their creative potential at the centre of sustainable growth, shaping an economy that works for all, where the concept of success and growth can be imagined. And really central to that new strategy is the concept of people-centeredness. And I want to start with you, Moky. What does that concept of people-centeredness and creative people-centeredness mean to you in your work?
Yeah. I think for us, you have to look at the context in which we work, because we cover Africa. Africa has 54 countries. There's about 60 cities with populations of over 1 million people. And if everybody's heard this thing about Africa's got a very young population. I think the median age in the UK is 40, which means 40, half the population is under 40. In South Africa, it's something like 28, so half the population is under 28. In Nigeria, it's 19. Half the population is under the age of 19. In Niger, another West African country, the median age is 15. And I say that because I think that gives us the context for why I think it's really important that we need to look at the creative economy in a different way. Because first of all, it's an easy, low barrier entry employer of young people, if you look at our context. But also, I think the creative sector is something that we need to encourage young people. One of the things that we're dealing with in a lot of cities, particularly I'll talk about Nigeria because I'm from there, is this movement called Japa, which is a movement of young people trying to leave the continent because they believe there's an American dream, the European dream, there's something better elsewhere. And I think we need creators, we need storytellers to help us reimagine what Africa could be, and to talk about the progress and and the vibe, the energy. And I think that's what's missing. So when I think about, about arts and culture and its role outside of the creative economy, I think about the power of the arts and culture sector to hold young people, to employ young people, but also to help them reimagine what the continent could look like. So and it's democratizing. We've always got a word in every panel. The last panel, it was what? It was instrumentalizing. Nobody could say it. This one is democratizing. It's the word I want to use because it's a young population. We're naturally more creative, but also we don't have a lot of money. Think what you were doing at 15 or 19. Certainly wasn't paying for stuff, I'm sure.
I think staying with that idea of how central democratisation is to a people-centred approach, I'd love to come to you, Natalia, because many studios that you run in Glasgow it's an artist studios, but it also has a lot of impact on the community around it. Can you talk about some of the strategies that you use to do that?
I kind of mentioned at the beginning there about the sort of conflation of organisational and curatorial practice, and I think for a lot of curators the idea is that we're kind of having to build organisations in order to do the work and maybe thinking a bit less about the sustainability or the value of that particular organisation and kind of placing that value on the creative production, which tends to be the case in sort of programming. And I think for me, or for many studios at least, the approach is really understanding the power of the organisation and how important it is that it exists in order to be contributing to the well-being of a place. So our kind of approach to organisational development is really, I guess, very similar to the approach of socially engaged art programming, where we're really thinking about how that organisation sits in that place. So I tend to work in organisations that are maybe not always in city context, but definitely always kind of on the fringe of a city or of a centre, and it's really thinking about particularly how, I mean, it often is the case that those places have really active communities because they've maybe already got a culture of self-organising if they're kind of disengaged a bit from the centre. So with many studios, we're in the East End of Glasgow, where there's a really long history of kind of community-run activity. It comes from, I suppose, being a bit outside of the sort of the attention or even the priority of council or government-led policy and practices, but it's really it's harnessed a real sense of community building in that place, and it means that as an organisation we can really work actively with people to really think about how we can exist there. And I think in the beginning, in terms of approach, in the beginning, maybe quite naively, we sort of saw ourselves as a kind of community centre or something. And as practitioners and as directors, that wasn't, I mean, I come from a background of working with artists and producing socially engaged work, not necessarily running a community centre. So it took us a little while to realise that actually, and when I say it took us a while, it took conversations with people around us to realise that the best that we could do for that area was be there. So to use our skills as best as possible to make sure that organisation can be there for a long time. And then in that sense, we're constantly contributing to the well-being of that place around us. So whether that's the 70 creatives that are working in the building who are patronising cafes, restaurants, pubs, the hundreds of artists that are coming to do work with us who are staying in local accommodation or working in schools or collaborating with the universities. I think really understanding that we're part of an ecosystem that really contributes to that place in so many ways. And like you say, it might not be quantifiable in terms of money all the time, but it really, really does contribute to the well-being of that place.
Absolutely, and it really puts me in mind of that point about listening that was made in the earlier panel around skills about, if you're taking a people-centred approach, it has to be absolutely in dialogue with that community that you're working in, and that's a really great example of that. Hector, coming to you now, Natalia mentioned well-being there, which is absolutely central to the mission of Makers Valley. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the pressing needs that you're aiming to meet in the community in Johannesburg and how you approach measuring your impact in the community?
Yeah. So measuring impact, I feel like, is one of the biggest challenges. But how we're stepping into the space is really as a mediator between community, the private sector, and the city. We host consistent engagement with the community across different things. What are the community's needs? What type of levels of unemployment do we have? Access to information and spaces. And we try in those engagements brainstorm different ideas that have come, hence they're coming from the community and they're going to be led by the community. One of the issues is that some of the information that the government speaks, articulates some of the stuff that they want to achieve doesn't connect with the people. So through those engagements, we now facilitate how the community can take up space. This goes across different things, but it's cultivating access to spaces, information, and opportunities, and we're just more or less the mediator, and talking on to CIDs, city improvement districts, on how our specific community is somewhat leading a community-based solution-orientated engagement. And there has been different types of, I would say, results that we see. That's people taking accountability for some of the edible gardens that we started on pavements that used to be dumping hotspots. That's now people who are taking up initiative to make the community more appealing by placemaking. So we get paint donations, and then we get people who are artists in painting the community. It's really just putting people first. But one of the things I'd also like to highlight is access to food and nutrition. And this was spotlighted during the pandemic. We started an organization called the People's Pantry, where we got different food organizations. We are working from a place called Victoria Yards, which is also some type of urban farm. So all the vegetables from the gardens get to be placed in a system where we encourage the community to recycle, and then from there they get points from recycling, and then with the points they go shopping at People's Pantry. It doesn't require any type of cash, but it's more or less a creative solution to access food for families that are struggling to provide for their families.
That's a really interesting example of a really creative take on a barter economy that actually thinks about getting people's skills involved as well. That's a really interesting initiative. Coming to you again, Moky, we heard from Laya this morning of the World Cities Culture Forum, and they recently published a piece of research that was commissioned by the British Council, the African Alternatives, the Future of Creative Cities report. And in that report really advocated for the need for proper data to inform cultural policies. And Africa No Filter has been working in a similar space, collecting data to devise the Creative Vibrancy Index, which you mentioned in your introduction. Can you tell us a bit about how that works and what sort of metrics you're using? 'Cause it's fascinating.
So I explained why we did it, because we wanted to make sure the infrastructure was there, and it was very difficult to find out what was going on the continent in terms of creative infrastructure. So it's actually, we did it with British Council, co-funded it with us, and an organisation called CC Hub in Nigeria did the actual research for us. And what we did, we looked at 12 cities, and the cities were representative across the regions of Africa, so east, west, southern, central, and whichever one I forgot. So it was 12 cities. And what we did, we looked at there were 22 indicators, but three very broad areas. One was the actual creative vibrancy. So how many theatres, how many cinemas, how many festivals. So for example, and the data is interactive, so you can go onto the website and look at it. So Lagos, for example, has 80 cinemas. Harare, for example, has 20. Lagos has X number of creative hubs. Harare has 0, apparently. And if anybody knows any different or any better, please go into the website and update it, because it's supposed to be a tool for people to use. So the first area was the creative vibrancy. The second was the enabling environment. And that was looking at things like, are there cultural policies? Freedom of expression, and we try to use data that was already there, because as looking for data is very expensive if you're generating new data. So we looked at existing data, and the third area was the creative economy, and that was kind of looking at IP and just how much transactional sort of money is exchanging hands in the creative economy. So at the top of the index was Johannesburg, strangely enough. Second was Cairo, and third was Lagos. And the reason why we did it as an index is because, as you probably know, all the solutions to the world's problems are in a big fat report somewhere, and nobody's reading it. So we decided we weren't going to do that, because we're dealing with A, the creative sector, and B, reason why we did it as an index is because we wanted cities to be able to rank themselves against each other in terms of what makes Johannesburg top. What does Johannesburg do right? And what can we learn from Joburg? And that was really important because I think cities in Africa have a lot to learn. There's a lot of similarities, but they have a lot to learn from each other. And that was one of the key things, that how do we kind of convey this data in a way that's accessible and usable? And that was one of the key things. So we've done it. We did it in 2022. And the next stage of it actually is not to go back and re-look at the data, because I don't think things change that quickly. Museums aren't going up that quickly. There are a couple of new ones actually coming up in Africa. But the idea is to look at those 12 cities and figure out how we can get people to use that data, because the data was designed for decision making. It was designed for policymakers to see where the gaps are, designed for potential investors to see where the opportunities are. And I don't believe that's happening enough. And the problem is that there isn't enough data right now on the African continent around the creative sector. But it's expensive. It's expensive to find that data. And all we're saying is this is a start. It's a small start. It's only 12 cities. Like I said, there's 60 other cities that are big enough that we could do. So we do need to do more. And we will keep on doing it, because I think creative infrastructure around cities is absolutely critical for the work that we are doing to shift narratives. Yeah.
And it's a fantastic approach, because it just cuts through in a sort of way of providing an observatory and taking the temperature of the entire creative economy across those cities in a way that is really clear. I'm really interested to see what happens with it, because like you say, I think it will take a while for people to start doing something with it, as these things do. I want that report, by the way, that has all the world's problems solved in it. Natalia, coming back to you, you mentioned in your introduction about working in rural spaces. And actually, even though we're here today, we're talking about cities, actually it's very useful to throw that into relief by thinking about the alternatives. So what are the main differences in the approaches that you take when you're working in rural as opposed to urban contexts, and how do they relate to each other?
I think I'm still figuring out the difference in approach, I would say, but I really advocate for people working in a rural context. I think in terms of thinking about innovation and imagination, my experience at least working in rural communities, but I think just in places where there is a really nurtured, active citizenship within communities, there's so much innovation to glean and to learn from that kind of context. I think there's something about the scale. So I directed an organisation in north of Scotland called Devon Projects, which have been in this particular area for almost 30 years now. And there's definitely something about longevity. There's something about being able to understand and track impact, which we've kind of spoke in and out of kind of through this conversation in the last roundtable as well, the difficulty of having data to show impact. And I think what was really interesting for me in that particular place is that you could see it because of the scale. So that organisation working in a particularly socially engaged way, the organisation worked with the motto of the town as a venue, and that was essentially to say there is no fixed venue. So we worked with hundreds of artists from all over the world who would be working with different parts of the community depending on what the project was about, but really placing work in the way of people and making work with people, and through that sort of process could see the impact on, like I said earlier, on education, on hospitality, on health and well-being. I think there's also, in terms of that scale, it's that the process of building partnerships is easier. I mean, than certainly than I've found in a city context where there's a lot more competition, or everything's a bit busier, and or people and institutions are a bit more rigid with how they work. Whereas in this sort of rural context, it was really easy to go right into schools and work with young people. We were playing a really particular role in terms of, there's maybe a bit of a danger as well, which you sort of alluded to in the last session, where arts organisations are playing a really particular role in social care to some extent. But there's a kind of a benefit of being able to work really closely with different sectors and with people in a really tangible way. But then, on the other hand, then kind of blurring those boundaries of what is the expectations or responsibilities of arts organisations. And I think that's what I'm kind of trying to figure out between those two spaces.
It's an ongoing,
Yeah.
it's an ongoing piece of work, isn't it? And I think, you know, more and more, as we heard from Laia this morning, as people are moving into cities, and I think she said 70% of the world's population are going to be living in cities. What about the other 30? You know, we have to make sure that those initiatives are kind of cutting across. Hector, we heard a little bit about some of the initiatives that you have put together for Makers Valley. I know one of the things that you do is really focus on supporting creative careers for young people.
Yes.
And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and the impact that it's had on the younger population in Johannesburg.
Yeah, so I think my own story kind of was very instrumental in that journey. So I used to work retail, and I was very driven towards, well, I love creativity. I want to do creative things. And I'm very passionate about the space. But looking at my community immediately, I saw that there's a number of challenges that some of my peers couldn't overcome. So how they access space, information. And from there, I saw an opportunity rather to say, okay, I want to more or less cultivate access to these things and support my peers. And started promoting music. And then from there, there was just challenge after challenge. You know, so from there, I just wanted to offer skills. So I love learning, so I've learned about soft skills. And then from there, in the Makers Valley capacity, we have an incubation program where we highlight the importance of social and creative entrepreneurship. And already we are based at Victoria Yards, which I would say is attracting a lot of people who can afford to buy things. Last year, or early this year actually, we partnered on a project called Sustainable Together, where we basically get the people who are starting these creative and social enterprises to access a market. So they get to showcase their products within Vic Yards, but there's a whole support and mentor process, because Victoria has a lot of artists and artisans who are running their creative businesses successfully. They're able to pay for rent. And as Makers Valley, since we're an intermediary, we more or less facilitate and communicate with the tenants to say, yo, you are doing something like this. On our database, we have X amount of people who are interested in learning this skill. Can you please hold space for them to learn from you guys, whether it's photography, whether it's fashion. And then from there, there's another organization called Lucha Lunaco, which runs more or less like a incubation program where they get paid learnerships. So they get to now shadow and work with this person in a professional sense while they're getting some type of stipend. So that's one way we do it, whereby we encourage them to start something, but we also help them get the experience and to be next to somebody who's already doing it on more or less like a bigger scale. And then through different channels, there's another organization or project called the SEF, the Social Employment Fund, where the Johannesburg Inner City Partnerships facilitates a process of different initiatives in placemaking. So we encourage people to basically learn, and this is done through these continuous engagements that I spoke of earlier. So we have a thing called Makers Meets, where different makers come through and then talk about what they make, whether it's the actual change making or if it's something tangible. And then from there, from those discussions, it's more or less like a soft networking session amongst the community, but they also get to share information on what are their challenges, what are they struggling with, and where are the opportunities where they can support each other and collaborate. And we try to facilitate this outside of funding, you know, and we do have a database of these things. It is exciting when you're engaging with people on the ground and learning about the numbers of hubs that exist. So there's Victoria Yards, there's Ellis House, there's August House, you know, there's Transverket. So there's more hubs that are emerging that offer some type of structure and support for these creatives to run and function like an enterprise, but still be able to do art for art's sake.
And I think that's I'm afraid we are going to have to finish there, but that's a really good point to end on, the importance of interconnectivity of all these initiatives that are happening in cities around the world, continuing to learn from each other, but also make connections for young people so that we can see some of those pipelines for talent development and opportunities, pathways coming through. So we've heard about the importance of creative endeavour in perception shift, in the wellbeing economy, creating opportunities for young people in creative entrepreneurship, and of course for impacting initiatives around sustainability in urban communities as well. So I think we've covered some fantastic ground there. So it just remains for me to thank our brilliant panel, Hector Dibakoane, Moky Makura and Natalia Palombo. Thank you so much.
Thank you.